Simon Birmingham, a campaign spokesperson and the Trade Minister as well. Thanks for your time.
G'day, Tom. Good to be with you.
Just to start in one of your old areas, childcare. Now, Labor's used essentially your model, your latest reform, to increase subsidies. That's a welcome, surely, for families that are going to be better off under Labor?
Well, it's not because they're undermining some of the integrity measures that are there. The Productivity Commission report that we commissioned was clear in terms of recommending a model where there was at least a small co-payment so that you could have confidence that claims made by childcare centres were legitimate, that parents were actually making some payment towards the cost of that childcare. It's an important part of the integrity because we know that historically there's been massive rorting in terms of childcare subsidies, billions of dollars taken out. We, as a government, have had to step in, clean up that system by suspending and cancelling many services that had been let to run by the Labor Party. We also know that childcare payments under our new model, in terms of out-of-pocket costs that families face, have gone down by around 9% over the first 9 months of operation of that new model. And that's been one of the reasons why inflationary data has been down, because we've driven down those out-of-pocket expenses.
Yes.
Whereas when the Labor Party was last in office and they tipped billions of extra dollars into poorly thought-out subsidisation of childcare, you saw prices skyrocket by 50%, which was just to the benefit of providers rather than to families.
So you're saying families all need to pay something, otherwise there's going to be an issue with rorting. What is the something, though? Would 5% be enough? Some countries have a few dollars a day that parents pay. Is that enough to avoid this so-called rorting? Because a lot of parents getting 100% subsidies at low income level would say, well, trust me, I'm working, why should I have to pay for it?
Well, in many cases, we have managed to bring those subsidies down to just $10, $12 a day, depending on what people are paying in terms of their daily childcare rate. So we've managed to bring that to a very negligible cost while dramatically increasing the support for families. You know, some families with a couple of children in the childcare system earning just $80,000 combined income as a family are often around $8,000 better off. So we've delivered substantial savings to those household budgets while driving down the out-of-pocket costs. And this is, I guess, the key contrast that runs as a common theme throughout this election campaign. Our policies, carefully thought through, done in a manner that ensures that Australia's taxpayer dollars are used wisely to deliver the maximum benefit to households. Labor's are big spending policies, but those big spending policies often end up being poorly targeted and result in a waste of taxpayer dollars.
Right, but when you look at childcare, this is an area essentially of productivity. Is it true to say that
it is? And you know what else we've seen since our new childcare subsidy came in? More children in care, families using more hours, more Indigenous children.
For people, for example,
people are using our model.
People right up until the high sort of 150s, I think, are going to be better off under Labor. Is it true to say now everything needs to be affordable, but the more money that can be given towards childcare, the more you're going to encourage people to get back into the work, the better off those families are going to be?
Well, the more money government spends, the more money government has to tax. So you've got to make sure in every area of government spending you target your spending effectively. Now, we've managed to achieve record levels of women's workforce participation. As part of the 1.3 million jobs that we've created, we've seen women's workforce participation hit record levels. That's a really proud achievement of our government, and the childcare reforms are part of that in making it easier for people to do so.
On workers, you've had a bit of an issue with Labor talking about an increase for pay, a government-funded increase for pay. Do you think there's a special case at all in terms of childcare workers being qualified, but it's hard to give them a pay rise because that means parents would pay more?
Well, our view is that you have to back the independent processes that exist. In terms of the setting of award wages, that's what we have a Fair Work Commission. And if politicians get in the middle of that, then the whole system unravels. And you saw that yesterday with completely polar opposite positions taken by Chris Bowen and Bill Shorten, from lunchtime to dinner time. At lunchtime, Chris Bowen was there saying, actually, this will be a really limited measure to just 100,000 of the 195,000 childcare workers. He was there saying that not everyone who's a childcare worker is an early childhood educator. They were his words, and that's what he said to justify why Labor's measure they've budgeted for is only 100,000, even though there are 195,000 at least working in the sector. At dinner time, Bill Shorten was on Q&A, and he was there saying that not only would this extend to childcare workers, but he was opening the door again to extending into aged care workers, disability workers, This is already a $10 billion promise.
And I understand
and where does it end if the government is going to subsidise all of these wages?
Getting asked those questions. But to you, do you think there's anything different about these workers? Because it's not just a question of going to the Fair Work Commission, but any pay rise has to be factored off against parents' ability to pay and whether they get back to work. This is a unique industry, isn't it?
Well, this is a very important sector. There's no doubt that the work early childhood educators do is incredibly valued, but the work that aged care workers do is incredibly valued as well. The work that people in our disability services sector do is incredibly valuable too.
They're all heavily subsidised by government as well. So when you say, how can you give a government pay increase to childcare workers? Well, the vast majority of money going to pay childcare anyway is government money. So is a pay increase via the government that unusual?
Well, it is in the sense that this is not about subsidising the costs of childcare. This is government saying that somehow, and Mr Shorten has said he'll work out the details after the election, but somehow the Labor Party says they're going to step in and subsidise directly private sector wages. Now, this is something that's never been done before, and will that extend to government picking up the superannuation contribution that is additional? How will it be done? Okay. Will it require, as the last time Labor tried this, a conditionality of union membership as part of it? Is it really just a drive to get more people into United Voice as union members? And these are the questions that are completely unanswered, as are so many when it comes to Labor's high-speed policies.
We'll see the detail. We keep asking them when we get them on the program. I want to talk negative gearing. If Labor wins power, the crossbench is already talking about not supporting it, and perhaps as well a different approach, curbing the amount you can negatively gear rather than just cutting it off from that date. What's the argument against saying capping negative gearing at 5 properties?
Well, Tom, that's not Labor's policy. Now, if somebody wants to put forward that policy, it's something the Parliament might consider down the track. But Labor's policy is to abolish negative gearing into the future outright, and yet we know that negative gearing is used commonly, frequently, by low and middle income households as a way to save for their retirement.
I understand that, but this is what the crossbench has now moved the argument on to. Essentially, Labor looks as though it won't get the support whatever happens. Do you have a strong argument against...
Tom, I'm firstly not accepting the premise that the Labor Party win the election.
Sure.
So that's
this is where the argument is
there.
now.
Our argument here and now is against Labor's policy and their pitch. And again, you've got to look at the holes in the detail of their policy. They, of course, had a whole lot of detail that was on the website of the Labor Party that went missing at the start of this campaign. It's never been replaced. It used to claim that around 93% of properties that were subject to negative gearing, new investment, were actually of existing dwellings.
That's detail around modelling, but none of their policies actually change.
That's important because this week Labor's going to release, they say, their budget costings. If those costings are premised on that assumption, then there's probably a big hole in those budget costings.
We'll see them. We will see them.
Because we know that other independent experts put as low as 50-odd% the actual rate at which investment in negatively geared properties is targeted towards existing dwellings.
And we'll see those numbers because they'll come out and they'll be, I understand, 2 or 3 days' time now. But is it fair to say it's harder to mount an argument if the crossbench says let's cap it to, say, 5 properties? You emphasise low and middle income families. Well, a low-income family is not going to have 5 negatively geared properties, are they?
Well, I heard the Shadow Finance Minister ruling out such consideration this morning. Labor are clearly sticking to their policy, and their policy hits the very first home that somebody on $50,000 or $60,000 or $80,000 as a family decides to invest in as a way to work towards their retirement, as a way to potentially, in some cases, even get into the housing market. I know, and I'm sure you know, many young Australians who, because of the mobility of their work, decide that the property they'll buy first is not a residential property, it's a property that they choose to negatively gear. Labor is going to shut the door on that opportunity for those people too.
The rent Vesta, perhaps we'll visit once the crossbench... if Labor wins, perhaps we'll visit that down the track, Simon Birmingham.
No, I hope that's not the case.
No, I know you do. And
for the sake of Australia.
Sure. Now, Donald Trump has made another threat against China on tariffs. What do you make of the way he's handling this trade dispute?
Look, I think there's commonly a degree of perhaps tactical brinksmanship that we see as part of some of these considerations in the way in which they play out publicly. Now, we have been pleased that the further elevation in tariffs that had been proposed earlier on had been deferred to enable discussions to occur, and we've welcomed those discussions. We would encourage them to continue rather than to see an escalation in tariffs and trade tensions that would be damaging potentially for global economic outlook. And it's a reminder a very strong reminder that we do have economically uncertain times around the globe, and that's why it would be exactly the wrong time in Australia's history to embark on a big spending, big tax experiment, as Mr Shorten proposes.
In a very direct way, though, do you agree with the sentiment that China is cheating the US and some other countries with tariffs, also with having, to have companies work collaboratively within China? Is that a sentiment you agree with?
Look, we have elements with which we concur with some of the US arguments or concerns they've elaborated with China in terms of the way in which you make sure that intellectual property is protected, the way in which you ensure that technology is protected, and ensure that trade considerations are done by the common rule book. And we urge both the United States and China to play by World Trade Organisation rules. They've served us well for decades in allowing trade to grow around the world, lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And for Australia, they've served us very well, as under our government we've shifted to a record trade surplus as a part of the trade deals we've done.
Just finally, an ALP Deakin candidate, the coalition claims could be a dual citizen. Labor say they're not. This is unresolved, really, isn't it, broadly in the parliament? I mean, we've had legal advice from both sides claiming things that hasn't turned out to be true.
Well, in the case of this candidate for Deakin, it's for Mr Shorten and the Labor Party to explain how it is that her apparent Fijian citizenship would enable her to be elected and to sit within the Australian Parliament. These are issues where we put in place reforms to the nomination process, reforms to the parliamentary disclosure process. They are important reforms that our government put in to try to ensure that we clean up the issues around Section 44. For Mr Shorten now to outline whether, in fact, his candidate is complying with those reforms and the rulings that the High Court made in the last term of Parliament.
Given though we even had some fall foul recently in the Liberal Party, I mean, can you guarantee right now there are no Liberal candidates that could fall foul of this section in the next Parliament?
But I'm confident that we have worked very hard with our candidates across our Liberal-held seats, across our winnable seats and across the board to ensure that
you can't guarantee it. That's the issue with this ongoing issue for both sides.
Well, Tom, I'm confident that that work has been done. I certainly know in my home division of South Australia that within the Liberal Party we have done exhaustive checks on those who have sought to nominate, that for a number of people their request to nominate was rejected because of the concerns that we had about their potential eligibility around Section 44. In relation to Labor's Deakin candidate, they're questions for Bill Shorten to answer and to provide that assurance to the people of Deakin that were they to elect that candidate, they wouldn't subsequently face an unnecessary by-election.
So thank you for your time, Simon Birmingham. I have to leave because we're going to your colleague, Josh Frydenberg.